I'm sure we made a few people kind of throw up in their mouths. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 290 of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Jerome Hardaway.
Hey everybody, how y'all doing?
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, gearing up for DevOps Remote Conf. You can go check it out at devopsremoteconf.com. We also have a special guest this week, and that's Brandon Hilkert.
Hello from Pennsylvania.
You want to give us a brief introduction? I don't know if we've had you on the show before.
Yeah, no, this is my first time, sure. My name is Brandon. I've been working on Ruby for, I guess, since 2009-ish or so. Had a background in Microsoft systems administration before that, and worked my way to development, then more open source, and that's how I ended up with Ruby. So I've been working on applications and products for the last 7 years or so, and with Ruby.
Very cool. And you wrote a book called Build a Ruby Gem.
I did. Yep. That was a couple years ago. It really started when I first started getting into Ruby and learning more about Rails. A couple years into it, it was clear to me that the community was strong because of not only open source, but everybody's contributions with Ruby gems. To be able to put together a Rails application and do just about whatever you can imagine just by Googling a Ruby gem, and a lot of times just putting it in the application. And so for me, it was a big light bulb moment, especially coming from Microsoft and the closed systems they had back then. That all this stuff relies on people contributing and maintaining, and so that was my first sort of foray into a really strong open source ecosystem. And so having gone through that and seen that, my first curiosity was, well, how do these things work? And at the time, I was working on an application and using kind of the standard stack of Rails with authentication and authorization and most of the tools that people use these days. And I wanted to give back in some way, and I knew that that required diving into open source Ruby gems, and understanding how they worked, and then being able to help projects do whatever I could to make them better. And so, when I wanted to go approach that, the first question was, well, what is a Ruby gem, right? And then how are they structured? How do they work? How do they work with the ecosystem as a whole? And that's really what caused me to dive in from a very analytical standpoint. My head wanted to understand every single piece of it before I sort of took the dive. So, I went in hard and tried to figure out all the pieces. And then it became clear to me that this wasn't just a challenge for me on my own. This was, a lot of people were having similar challenges, not only for how are Ruby gems work and how are they structured, but how do I get involved, and how do I start? If I want to contribute, how do I contribute? What goes into it? How do I find the right project? Do I just pick an issue off, or ways to contribute? So I think it first started with a blog post I wrote about, it was called 3 Ways to Get Started with Open Source. And it was kind of one of those moments. I had first started the blog and posted it, and it did one of those kind of Hacker News front page results. And I thought, wow, man, this is something other people are thinking about too, and it seems to be valuable. And so that's sort of where I continued down that path of diving into, well, what was interesting about this piece, and then what is it that people want to know more, which ultimately led me to Ruby gems and their structure.
So there's more to it then than just using Bundler to create a gem and then putting all of your CRUD into the lib folder?
Yeah, you certainly could do it that way, I think. One of the, as most listeners probably know, Rails being a big ecosystem in the Ruby community, there's a lot of ways to integrate into Rails, and that's what I've found to be one of the most common questions around, whether it's you want to integrate with Active Record, or you want a controller module, right? Or a rake task, right? Or I want to be able to install my gem that puts database migrations into my application. There's a lot of levels of that integration, and I tried to spell out in the book how to go about those pieces. But for sure, the most commonly asked question is about Rails engines and the power that they bring, and the power you can how you can extend an application through, whether it's JavaScript assets or a number of other things. But Rails engines seem to be one of the more popular questions I get asked through the book.
Yeah, I can see that. There's definitely more to Rails engines than just create a gem with bundler and then put all your crap in lib.
Well, I think that, the good thing about bundler is that it gives you a lot of the things you need, with a single command. And I definitely used bundler as the tutorial in the book. And, with like all the details in a gem spec, it's necessary to get started. You don't want to have to dig into what methods are necessary on the spec file. And, it just gets you running pretty fast. And so for someone that wants to just dive in, a single command and then maybe a few methods, you have a gem, start to finish pretty quickly. For someone that, wants to take a more complex piece of code and modularize it in this way, bundler helps remove kind of those pieces that are far less interesting, right? The kind of the scaffolding of the whole thing and giving you some rake tasks out of the box to immediately release new versions, push to GitHub, all that stuff. So, with those tools now, it makes it pretty easy. But yeah, I think throwing everything in the lib directory could end up to be a mess if you let it. That's not to say it wouldn't work, right?
Right.
It would definitely work. But that's one of the things where, as I've seen people, fortunately start to create new gems, it extends the ecosystem. At the same time, it's potentially a negative, right? Because we have a lot of gems in the community that are very good and do what you want. And so there's less space to sort of innovate there in a sense of for feature parity, right? Like it's pretty unlikely somebody's going to come out and say, this is the new thing that every Rails app needs. And that's going to be the case. So I think it gets people started quickly, but there's a sense of responsibility around the community and what you create and what you put out there to be public. One of the common things that I heard a few times after I released the book was, from people that clearly had a lot of experience in the community was, well, this is going to cause, a bunch of different versions of random gems and then just like clog up this, our community here with gems that are pointless or testing or, just kind of clogging up Ruby gems. And, I think that's probably true in some sense that people made some test gems to try and see how things worked, how they integrated in your application. But at the same time, people need to start somewhere. And I think that was a good place to do it. But I have a chapter in the book about, sort of the responsibility of the open source Ruby gem creator, pointing out those issues that, creating a duplicate named gem that's already out there is not productive and is not helpful, right? So if I go looking for the Sidekick gem, and somebody else, and there's 5 GitHub repositories that show up for Sidekick, that's not helping anyone. Right now I need to dig into Ruby gems maybe and see which one is sort of the official release of Sidekick if I didn't know. And so with the naming, it's important to sort of keep that out of the way from the existing tools out there. Make sure you're not kind of walking on someone else's toes and make it clear to those that come after you if they choose to use your gems, which one they're using.
That makes sense. I do want to back up a minute because I know that we have people who are new to the community. We always have new people coming in. So can you just walk through the process that you go through to create a gem? Just so
I was actually going to ask that as well. Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel like your book does it correlate with like new users, people who are new to Ruby? So I think what we do in our nonprofit, teaching them how to build a Ruby gem and doing some of the smaller things like using Rack and Sinatra, we value that and feel like it's an important skill to have if you're going to be a Ruby dev. So I want your input on that as well.
Yeah, the book starts with assuming that you know Ruby, just a little Ruby. And it doesn't mean you're an expert, but it also doesn't, go through, at some point you have to make an example to build a gem. And in the book's case, I used a lottery number generator. So there's not tons of methods within the gem itself. It's called Megalotto, but it also doesn't say, here's how to generate an array and here's how to take, a sample from the array. It assumes that those are either things that you feel comfortable with or that you're, savvy enough to look up to say, oh, okay, I know what this method does. But having said that, it also assumes that, you've not created a gem before. So it's, the basics. So to answer your question about, the path, I mean, like Chuck said, it's to get started, bundle, if you have bundler installed in your system, which most do at this point, bundle space gem, and then space, the name of your gem. So for Sucker Punch, for instance, is a gem I wrote a couple years ago. And so you would do, if you were starting fresh, you would do bundle space gem space and then the name Sucker Punch. And it would create a project scaffold for you with a lib directory, a gem spec, rake file, all the files sort of necessary to get your gem started and get writing code. It would spit that all out for you in a structure that was acceptable and made sense. And so, Ruby gems themselves, it spits out this structure. If you wanted to do no more than just package it, a Ruby gem in the sense is that whole folder directory just packaged up and uploaded to, it can be uploaded anywhere, but in most cases, public gems are uploaded to rubygems.org, which is the keeping repository for most of the functionality that people use in Ruby gems.
All right, cool. Thank you. Thank you for expanding that.
So
yeah, definitely. One side point is that just the code, the code structure. Bundler does give you a lot of stuff, but if like me at the time, I was working on a Rails application, and I came into the Ruby community sort of with Rails all at the same time, and I think a lot of people do at the same time. Although you mentioned that a lot of people or some of the the camps are starting with Rack and Sinatra, and that's awesome too. One of the things that's not obvious if you start with Rails or a system that does some kind of auto loading is the code directory. If you have a lib folder and you have an entry file, the name of your gem, you're going to load all the other files that are in your gem, and that's not necessarily something that's obvious to a lot of people. I think in a way Rails has spoiled us to know that if we put something in a directory, it's going to be loaded and the namespace will be there and it'll load just fine. And so one of the things that I go deep into is not only the structure, which is predominantly a lib directory with some files in it, but what do you need to do to load those things inside, right? And if you have dependencies, this sort of dependency tree, how does that take place? What do you need to, because you need to write more than just, make sure the code's loaded, right? You need to have a module namespace. You need to make sure everything's within it, or that's sort of being the good citizen in the community. What are these like kind of community approved ways to put it out there? And so loading is a separate chapter in the book, which that was one of the hardest things for me when I was starting to understand why it was that way and what was happening. It was all very manual in the end when I looked at it compared to, what I had known from Rails. But at the same time, this is truly, lower level Ruby, right? And it makes sense when you put it all together, but it also gives you some insight to what is Rails actually doing, which is also an interesting topic. But knowing where things are loaded, how they load, knowing that this is just a bunch of Ruby files put together, it's pretty incredible. It works the way it does, but there's more to just like Chuck said, throwing stuff in a lib directory. You actually have to load the files.
All right, let's take a break and earn a little money for the show by talking about Hired.com. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. They put you in control, fill out an application, and then top employers apply to hire you. Throughout the process, your dedicated talent advocate will also have your back, providing unbiased career coaching to help you put your best foot forward with potential employers. And Hired offers access to more than 4,000 innovative employers, including big brand names like Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. And they help people find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. So if you're open to relocation, you can let them know, and they'll work that in too. Finally, if you use our link, you can earn double the normal hiring bonus. The normal hiring bonus is $1,000, and they give you $2,000 instead. So go check them out at hired.com/RubyRoguesPodcast. I'm also curious. So one of the things that I go back and forth on with gems is testing. And in particular, I kind of have two thoughts about it. One is that usually when we ship a gem, we ship everything, including the tests. And, the people running the gem don't necessarily need those tests. It's only the people who are developing on it. So if they're going to customize it in some way, then they're going to want those tests. But otherwise, they don't need them. But yet all of that stuff tends to ship with the gems. And I've wondered for a while if there's a better way to handle that. Because, people wind up using like RVM or, gem sets within RVM. So they have 4, 5, 6, 7 copies of the gem on their machine. And, then they have copies of all the fixtures and testing stuff and everything else. Is there a solution to that, or is that just something we live with as Rubyists?
Yeah, it's a good point. I guess that's dividing the line between, did you download the gem for your application to just use, the public interface, or did you download it for development, right? Because development, obviously, you need all those other extra things. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. I don't know offhand, but it'd be interesting to know the trade-off, whether it be file size or just storage needed on, say, Ruby gems, for instance. I think most gems are probably sourced from GitHub at this point. I'm taking a guess, but they obviously need to keep those files there. But if Ruby gems didn't have all that extra development, focused files and content, would it be more efficient? Probably, right? I'm not sure how much, but maybe it's certainly simpler to push everything around together from like an infrastructure standpoint. So it's always there, but I hear what you're saying. It doesn't do your Rails application much good if you have tests that are not actually being run, or a bunch of fixtures that get downloaded on your production server and then loaded up every time your process starts.
One other argument I get into with people a lot, because I kind of agree. I don't know if there's a good answer for that one, but I was curious what your take was. Another one that I get in arguments with people about a little bit is whether or not they should write like the entire system into a gem, or whether or not they should break it up. So, for example, Rails is a gem. Now, Rails is mostly a wrapper around a whole bunch of other gems. So it pulls in Active Record and JSON and all the other gems out there. But it's a huge gem. Or even if you come down a little bit and look at Active Record, or Active Record's built on Active Model, and Active Model does a ton of stuff. And Active Model actually has like 5 or 6 modules that you can pull into your own class to make an Active Record compatible class. So, do we write these? Should it all be in one ginormous gem? Or should you be able to just pull in, say, Active Model validations, or Active Model, I forget what all of them are. But just pull in those little pieces and then compose your library out of that. So I only need the validations. I don't need the other bit that Active Model provides.
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen, I think, a push to smaller gems. With the dry, kind of dry organization that they're starting with some smaller focus gems, and you've certainly seen probably some element of that with the coming from the JavaScript community, right? And there was a big thing about small modules, and that's a whole nother ball of worms, I guess. But it's I think I also heard a lot of things about the engines. I think some of that was the engines question, the fact that was one of the more common questions, spurred from a lot of people's interest in microservices over the past couple of years. Where you would end up with, say your production application, and then maybe an admin application, and then maybe something else for marketing, right? If you're making a product, but the core models all needed to be the same. And a lot of the questions were around, well, I need an engine because my business models, they're the Active Record based models, were common across all these apps. And I want to extract those and put them in a gem. How would I do it? Or how would I do it if I want to have migrations? And I sense that people were doing it because that's what they were led to believe should happen. And it felt like the path of the least resistance, maybe. Clearly, you could copy those to another app, which I've done a number of times and it works just fine. But in a lot of sense, the real early on, Ruby, at least when I was starting Ruby, it was all about being dry, right, and not having this logic all over the place, duplicated. And while dry doesn't necessarily mean exactly the duplication of the lines, people took it as that. And so anytime you copy and pasted something, that was seen as like a no-no, right? And they wanted to do the right thing and extract it. And I've seen people get into some pretty dicey situations with just extracting business models, which you can imagine are part of everything you do, right, in the core of it. And so really working out the testing strategy with that. And they always need to be involved in the host app to work properly. I've seen that really go down some bad paths. And for personal experience on products I've worked on too, that were technically engines that had database backed tables, and it can get messy, especially when you're sharing it across a bunch of applications, and then you make one little change, right? And you need to update it everywhere. That may or may not be the case if you would copy the file, depending on what the application needs.
I've actually been there. So devchat.tv. Yeah, you've all used the app that did this. Devchat.tv, before I moved it back to WordPress, was actually set up. It had an admin app. It had a sponsorships app. It had, a bunch of other, services basically that made up the entire system. And I wouldn't say it was painful. It was closer to excruciating.
Okay.
But yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. And yeah, in some ways.
What were some of the bigger issues that you remember?
Well, for example, sometimes we'd make a change we didn't think would affect one system, but would affect another system. And then it would turn out that, oh, wait, this does affect that system. Or we'd get through a deploy and we'd find out that 3 versions ago in our core gem, there was this small issue that, we changed something and it turned out not to be an issue in the app we were actually working on, but it did turn out to be an issue in the app that this other app. The other thing was it was just, there was a lot of mental gymnastics that had to happen just to keep track of what was happening where and when and why. And so even when everything worked, it was like, okay, I'm making this change. I think it's going to have this effect. But we were never quite sure because the use cases were different in all the different apps. And the only way to really test it and make sure that everything worked everywhere was to run it everywhere. But nobody wanted to actually run those tests everywhere when we changed the core. And so we had a sample app that we ran the tests on, and it caught most of the bugs that we wound up writing before they ever got deployed. But at the same time, it was just, it was really, really painful. And, being in a position, if I had to do it over again, I would probably consider just writing those models into each system and then having one system responsible for the migrations. And because that's the other bit that you have to deal with, right, is those migrations. And if you, if they're sharing a database. But the other thing is then I could just put the logic that each of those apps cares about. And if there is some shared logic somewhere, then we could just break that into a module that isn't dependent on the state of the model and just do it that way. But,
yeah, that makes sense. I work on an app now that does a lot of that, and I've just copied it over. And one of the things that I noticed real early on was in a Rails app, for instance, the validations, for the core production app for customers, were different than what might have been needed for an admin, right? And so you get in a state, maybe the customer did something to their account and it's in a place that's not great, right? And they need to come fix it or something. You go into the admin app and the admin has some ways to change, if it's a SaaS app, you might have to change the subscription or a trial date, and you go to update that and it's no longer valid because of some things that the customer is controlling, right? And so validation fails and it says, their email is invalid. And you're like, well, I'm changing the trial date. I don't care about the email, and whether those are, let's assume they're on the same model. But then you're stuck, right? And you're in a position where you say, okay, well, maybe I don't want this validation on the admin app, right? Now you're left to say, well, if it was an extracted gem, well, maybe do I put a conditional in? I don't know, do I give the host, some name and say, well, don't apply this if it's that host, right? And then you go down this rabbit hole of conditional logic, which, from the start, you're like, man, I wish I just copied that model in there. It's like 4 lines, right, for the admin app. So I've copied them lately and been perfectly happy with it. There's been a few cases where, I changed one thing in say the production kind of customer facing app, and it was necessary for the admin app. But I've also sort of reserved myself to the fact that the admin app can blow up every once in a while, and it's not the end of the world. And I don't want the customer app to do that. So yeah, I'll take those instances where I just need to like fudge a line, or I forgot to make a changeover. I'll take those over, knocking production over for sure.
I'm sure we made a few people kind of throw up in their mouths. You copy code.
Yeah, right.
This episode is sponsored by Compose.io. Databases are arguably the most difficult part of the stack to manage. The last thing you want is to wake up at 4 a.m. because the database failed and you have no backups. Compose has all that covered for you, so rest assured that your database is fast, reliable, and always on. It's production-ready cloud databases on AWS and GCP for SoftLayer. So go check them out. You can pick from 9 databases including MongoDB, Elasticsearch, Redis, RethinkDB, MySQL, and one of the latest, ScyllaDB, which is a fast drop-in replacement for Cassandra. All databases come with guaranteed RAM, IOPs, and CPU that auto-scale, automatic daily and on-demand backups, high availability nodes, security you can count on with private VLAN, IP whitelisting, SSH and SSL, two-factor authentication, and much more. Deploy your database in minutes, and they'll take care of all of the administrative tasks like patches and upgrades. Setup is fast and easy, so go try them out for 30 days free at compose.com/devchat.
I have a question. I want to get more into like your experience, like the idea of the why behind building certain things. I want to get into the why of building Sucker Punch. Like I said, we just spoke about Sucker Punch about a week ago, and I really wanted to ask your opinion on why did you feel like the community need that type of gem? It says it was heavily, it uses concurrent Ruby, heavily influenced by Sidekick and Girl Friday. But do you see that Sidekick and Girl Friday were maybe building that you feel like Sucker Punch was able to help the community in?
Yeah, I'll give you sort of like a more long-winded process of this because it was sort of a stepping ground for me. When I mentioned I wanted to dig into the open source ecosystem and do some work there, part of it was I wanted to just learn about some code or approaches that I hadn't seen before. And so I was pretty isolated in my role at the time in that I wasn't on a big team. I wasn't surrounded by people that had tons of experience, and I really wanted to learn. And I thought a great way to do that was to contribute. And one of the things I knew that I was that I needed to work on and needed to understand better was multi-threading and how how you can implement it in Ruby. And at the time, Sidekick was and probably still is the most popular project to deal with multi-threading. And I approached Mike Perham, the maintainer, and was looking to get involved. And at the time, we were a big user of Sidekick, and the dashboard for Sidekick was something that I used all the time. But there were some elements of the dashboard that I wanted to be better. There were some pieces that, for instance, when you looked at the dashboard, you could refresh it and it would give you some stats, but it didn't auto refresh. And so there were times when we were sort of batch running jobs and I'd want to know how many processed in the last couple seconds. And I couldn't figure that out just by looking at the dashboard, maybe refreshing a second later and trying to do some math or whatever. So if you've seen Sidekick today, there's some kind of process graphs on how many jobs are processing. And that was something that I wanted to implement. But it turns out that, much of the back end sort of API data piece was not there. And so I spent a lot of time digging into Sidekick, which caused me to, kind of dig into gems, understand how they were structured. And then ultimately, because I wanted to be exposed to a project like Sidekick with threads, I figured, well, in a way I can contribute my experience with web and maybe add this functionality to the web UI, ultimately sort of just getting exposed to the other pieces that I didn't know. So it would just help me kind of move along my experience with multi-threading and within Ruby. So I dug in there, and that's what sort of got me exposed to all that and feel more comfortable. And then at some point, I was doing some kind of apps on the side just for fun. And I had an app that was hosted on Heroku, and it needed to do some heavy background work. And dragging in Sidekick certainly would have worked, but being a sort of thrifty night and weekend developer on these random toy apps, I didn't necessarily want to spin up a whole other dyno for just the Sidekick worker. And at the time, before this was before Heroku's pricing model changed, but the dyno was I think $35, and then you had a free web one. So it would have meant this app that I didn't really care about, but actually people were using, surprisingly. I'd have to start incurring some costs there So, being sort of like savvy developer type, right? The first thing was like, well, how can I not spend the money? And one of those ways was, well, if I were able to do this work that I want to do in the background in line, it wouldn't cost me any money, right? Because I have this free web dyno, and I wouldn't have to spin up a new process to run these background jobs. So Girl Friday was a gem that at the time Mike Perham also maintained, and it had that same model that within a single web process you could do some background work. And after talking with him quite a bit through my Sidekick work, I realized that it was an implementation that was older, and I don't think it was something he wanted to continue the way it was. And at the time, Sidekick used Celluloid, which was still is a framework to use do multi-threading in Ruby. And so I got into that, and I thought, well, seems like it'd be pretty easy using Celluloid the way Sidekick does, but just do it in a single process. And so that was part of my sort of learning experience about all this multi-threading and how does Celluloid work. And so the first version of Sucker Punch was using Celluloid, and actually, to be frank, it wasn't very complex at all. It was a few files, and it was really a DSL on top of Celluloid, because Celluloid had all the tools I needed to make a background queue, but it was somewhat verbose in a way that you would set it up, and it wasn't clear when you were you weren't necessarily writing a job. You were pushing this thing onto a mailbox in one of the classes that Celluloid was loaded into. And so just creating sort of an easy to use DSL like Sidekick did for jobs and queues, doing the same thing with Celluloid was easy. And so Sucker Punch was born out of this need to run jobs within a single web process and not incur the cost of another process or server cost. It doesn't necessarily have to be monetary, but process wise, your production servers wouldn't need an extra process either. But having said that, I don't want to suggest that that's like going to save everyone's day, because there's obviously some downsides to that. There's memory bloat in the single web process, and obviously if the web process dies, your jobs die too. So if you queue up 1,000 jobs and you cut the process off, the number of jobs that didn't finish are gone, right? Because they're stored in memory. They're not backed by a data store like Redis, as in the case with Sidekick. So there's some trade-offs, but for me, I was doing work at the time that that didn't matter. And so I would always get updates, and the update, if I missed one in between, would have taken care of the one in the middle. So it wasn't a huge deal. But, to this day, I still, on the Sucker Punch README, still suggest that, it's best used for things like logs, right? Well, logs in a sense that if you don't care if a few drop, they don't drop, but, if for some reason your server dies, they will be lost if there was a bunch queued up. So there are some trade-offs, but at the same time, for my use case, it didn't really matter. So I wasn't thinking very holistically about what does the community need, and is Girl Friday used, and what's the next version of Girl Friday. It was really just a use case for me, and I used Girl Friday in the app that I was working on. It worked just fine, but also at the same time, it was like, oh, what if we did this differently? And so I don't know whether it was just about visibility into the project or right time or whatever, but people seem to latch on to it, and it was used. I feel like it's being used in a similar case where you have a small app, you don't want to really have an extra process to run or that costs money or whatever, and you're trying to do things cost efficiently, and Sucker Punch gets dragged into those situations.
Roger that. All right, thank you.
So I want to go back to gems here for a minute. Because there's another end of gems other than just, hey, we're going to publish this. Don't name it something that somebody else has already named it. And that is getting it published to Ruby gems. So, in the example of Sucker Punch, what does it take to put it up there so somebody else can use it? I think I've done it. I'm guessing Jerome's done it. But, for those people who they get their little library written, or maybe their big library written, and they go, okay, I want other people to be able to pull this down through Ruby gems. How does that get on somebody else's computer?
Yeah, I think, once you do it the first time and that create an account on Ruby gems, it's all easily handled. And so realistically, at this point, if I want to release a new version of Sucker Punch, I type rake release, and that's the end of it. And assuming I've versioned everything properly, incremented versions, let's say I'm on version 0.4 and I want to go to 0.5, I bump a version file up and then add the, appropriate change logs and do all those other sort of developer responsible tasks. Rake release is the end of it. If you're starting, if you don't have an account on Ruby Gems, you would create an account there, and then you would associate your gem, which is done through the gem spec file, to your email or your account that you've signed up with. And after that, I think the first time it asks you to sign in from the command line, it all just works from there. So it's pretty easy.
Yeah, and if I remember right, when you sign up for that account, it actually it'll give you a walkthrough. It'll tell you what commands to run in order to get it up there.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits with using Bundler, and that your rake file has some files loaded to make all those tasks pretty easy for you. I think there's a release command and install, and there's probably some more, but it has everything you need, and it is pretty easy to get started.
So are there any gotchas then to this whole process of writing a gem or publishing a gem?
Yeah, I think the only gotchas are more about kind of doing things in a way that is maintainable and helpful. And as a community, we have a ton of options for all different kinds of functionality, and I think the Ruby community has grown up sort of feeling like, okay, just add another gem to the gem file, and our life's problems will be solved. And that's sometimes the case, but there's also plenty of gems that may not be sort of good citizens in the ecosystem, and we're left to sort of figure that out on our own, whether it's we inspect the gem itself or we take recommendations from colleagues that we trust. There is definitely an element of trusting how that gem is set up and what it does, right? Because you're ultimately putting this code into your app and saying, I trust everything it does. And not only that, but I potentially trust newer versions of this gem, right? Depending on how you load the gem into your application, and whether you allow it updates and you do bundle update regularly, or you say only a certain minor release. It's something that we're allowing this code to be in our application. So I think there's some element, again, going back to that responsibility piece, really knowing how these things work, is sort of being that good Ruby community citizen. Because if this code will be used, and we hope, you hope that it is useful for other people, it'll make your application better, but also, it could have some downside to it. Right? If we load some code and it's like in this global namespace and we overwrite some methods and you're not really sure what happens, you see these issues a lot of times if you look at the gem repos, that there's questions or, people are confused. I think just having that all kind of straightened out and knowing kind of the lay of the land really helps to be that good citizen in the community, if you're going to publish and maintain gems, especially. And that's another piece of it is the maintenance part. I mean, clearly there's a responsibility to putting something out there, but then, letting it die, that's not really doing anybody any good. So if you extract some functionality from your app, or, something that you have an expertise in that you believe others will use, you're really kind of sending a message that, unless you say otherwise, obviously, that this is out there, and, you may not update it ever, but you also, try to be respectful about the state that the code is in, whether it should be used, whether it's, you feel good about it, that kind of thing. Because, there's plenty that I'm sure we've all seen that have sort of rotted, and you really don't know what to expect. And so whether that's looking at the gem and understanding what to look for, do you look in there and there's no test, there's no spec directory, there's no test directory? How does that make you feel? Is that good enough? Is the functionality minimal enough that it doesn't really matter to you? All those things. There are a lot of elements that go into trusting code, but adding a gem into your application is not a task that should be taken lightly, and it does have potential consequences. So I think there's an element of scrutiny that's required to build long-standing applications that won't be a maintenance burden.
Gotcha. Hey, do you need a sanity check on your code? Make sure all the tests are passing. Make sure all the static assets compile. All the normal things that you need to do to make sure that your application is ready for production. Then you need continuous integration, and I recommend Snap CI. Snap CI is a product put together by our friends at ThoughtWorks, and it works great to pull all of your information together about your application, make sure it's ready for production, let your team know if it fails, and overall just make your life easier. So go check them out at snapci.com. One other thing that I wanted to go into is I know some people go out and they write yet another YAML parser or something, right? And it's kind of a gee whiz project, and oh, this is fun, and I'm learning how to parse YAML, and then they think, well, somebody else may want to use this. Should they release it as a gem for other people to grab?
I don't see why not. One of the things that you can hope for if you're going to release code is that others will chip in and help you if they want to see it pushed forward. So, if there's some functionality that your new YAML parser does that, others don't, but yet it's incomplete, you'll start to see pretty quickly that if people are using it, there'll either be issues or feedback, whether it's from Twitter, whatever place you want it sent. But I think starting to see that feedback, you hope that not only will people add feature requests, but they'll also chip in. And so one of the things you could do to be more explicit about that is on the README, be explicit about your contributions and what you'd like changed, or whether it's already kind of pre-listed issues that you say, look, this is where I want it to go. Sidekick's another great example of, I think Mike does a fantastic job of managing the project, and he has the luxury of doing that because people are paying for the paid versions of Sidekick to help fund his support of that. But he'll put in an issue about a feature that's not there yet, but how he sort of wants it to work, and it's start of you'll see people chip in and offer some feedback about, well, in my app this wouldn't work that way because of X, Y, and Z. And it's good to get feedback like that. So, but whether you do it in an issue or in the README itself or through maybe a changelog, or there's a variety of ways to be explicit about what you want help with or how you want contributions to work. Being explicit is a great first step, and kind of fostering that sense of community and making it clear that you'd love help if people are interested.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Jerome, why don't you start us off?
Roger that. It's close to the holidays, so right now I know that everybody has geeks in their life and they're trying to figure out what to buy for, but they don't know what to buy. So I chose one website in particular. That's my only pick for this week. Is thinkgeek.com. It's a really fun website with a really diverse set of gifts. My favorite one personally is the "No, I will not fix your computer" T. That is something that I saw recently that I was like, I have like 100 people in my contacts that if I buy this for, it'd be the perfect gift for. So that's my pick for this week.
Yeah, I've actually told my family, my brothers and sisters, my wife's brothers and sisters, and everybody else, I'm like, look, if you aren't either my parents or her parents or our grandparents, the answer is no unless you catch me when I'm like high on something. So.
Well, I have a wife that will just yell at me on their behalf. So basically, it's a immediate family, both sides extension. But outside of that, once it gets to cousins, I'm like, nah, I can't help you. Go away.
Yeah, I have 9 brothers and sisters, and it was happening on a rather frequent basis. That's when I put my foot down. Yeah. I'll jump in with a couple of picks here. The first pick I have is. I've been playing around with Facebook ads, and it turns out that you can actually. I found the lookalike audience on Facebook ads a while back, and I thought, oh, that's cool. So essentially, what you do is you upload a series of emails, and then they find the people on Facebook that have those emails, and then they munge through their profiles, and they figure out kind of the common threads between those people. And so then you can advertise to people like the people on that list. What I learned is that you can also upload a list, like say your email list, and you can retarget ads back to those people. So instead of a lookalike list, it's the list. And so I think that's pretty awesome. And I'm looking at some ways to make people a little bit more aware of things like DevOps Remote Conf and stuff like that. But anyway, it's been really awesome to kind of learn about these things. I picked it up from a mastermind group, and that's the second pick I'm going to put out there is having a mastermind group. So I do one mastermind group that's live every week. It's on entreprogrammers.com. And then I have two others that I meet with every week. One just started. The other one I've been in for about a year and a half. And the difference is mainly that between the three, I think three is too many, actually. Two is enough. One is enough if you've got the right group. But the one group is focused primarily on business. The other one is focused primarily, we talk about business, but we also talk about like family and kids and relationships and stuff. And so I kind of get two different sets of input from them. But yeah, so I talk about things that I'm trying to do better, or things that are not going the way I want, or things like that. And they encourage me to do better. They give me suggestions on how I can do those things better and all those things. So having a group like that you meet with every week, and you check in and you have some accountability, and they help you figure this stuff out, has been invaluable. So if you're out there, even if you're not in business for yourself, just for career and family and friends and everything else, if it's just nice to have that input in your life. So I highly recommend to people that they go out and they find people who have similar concerns to them, that have different experiences than them, and form a group, and then share your experience and help each other out. Been very, very helpful to me. So I guess the overall pick, if you're going to put a bullet point on it, is mastermind groups, but there's a ton more than that. And it comes out of the book Think and Grow Rich, which is a terrific book too, so I'll pick that too. Brandon, what are your picks?
Cool. My first pick is somewhat self-serving in that it's the app that I work on every day, but it's called Bark, and we make software to help keep kids safe online. So if you have kids, on social media, email, text, and you're worried about both incoming and outgoing messages that may not be appropriate, we make some software to do that. I'm really proud of the work we've done and some of the things we've been able to help families with. And then I have two non-technical picks. As someone who, oh, you do?
Yeah,
that's exciting.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Thanks. Two non-technical picks. The first is as someone who doesn't love cold weather, I struggle with the right socks and working at home and slippers and whatever. So I recently got into merino wool socks, and as a runner, this comes up in running socks a lot, but it's great at moisture wicking. And anyway, I found they're also pretty expensive at times. So I found some socks called People Socks on Amazon, and it's a 4-pack, and it's only $22, where you can find a single pair of these types of socks for that price at times too. So really high concentration merino wool, and they've been awesome so far. We're only a month and a half into it, but so far so good. And my last pick is a book called The Food Lab. I recently got it. I'm not a huge cook, but I enjoy eating, and I enjoy cooking when I do it. This book is a huge book, probably 1,000 pages or so, but it has tons of technical experiments with food. This is a MIT engineer that got into the food industry after school and just kept down that path. But he took a very scientific approach to learning about food and how things cook into really fine details. And I think most engineer types would enjoy this. If you have any interest in food or whatever, topics like how to make the perfect burger, the perfect hard-boiled egg. I've found it fascinating so far, and I'm just through the breakfast section. So it's called The Food Lab, Better Home Cooking Through Science. And even if you don't love to cook, I think there's some fascinating science and really data-driven approach to cooking meals and making things great through preparation and cooking. So anyway, it's been fun for me, and it'll certainly give me plenty of entertainment since I'm probably 100 pages into 1,000. So
very cool. If people want to follow up with you, see what you're doing, read a blog, check you on Twitter, anything like that, where do they go?
Yeah, the website, brandonhilkert.com. I have a regular blog that I post out to. You can sign up for the mailing list there if you're interested in keeping up, or just deck back every once in a while. I'm Brandon Hilkert on Twitter too. Same with GitHub. Pretty easy to find me. I don't really hide anywhere, but you can find all my work on those places. And I would love to hear from people if they have questions or thoughts or whatever. I'd love to chat. So open to it.
And if people want to get your book?
Yeah, it's off my site, so it's probably the easiest way. Just go to brandonhilkert.com. There's a book link on the left there, and click through, and you'll see the book. There's a couple packages up there if you're interested with screencast and and some other stuff for your team if you want. But otherwise, the ebook is up there, a bunch of different versions and everything, and you should have everything you need from there. There's some sample screencasts and a sample chapter if you're interested in that too. So yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback on it.
Awesome. And your notes for us for the show says that you can get 25% off. If you're a listener, just follow our link.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'll have a link up there. So feel free to hit that and let me know if anybody has any feedback or thoughts.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you for coming, Brandon.
Thanks a lot again. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for your insight.
Yeah, no problem. It's been fun.
All right, we'll catch everyone next week.